Okay, hi everyone. My name is Mark Fabian. I'm a research associate at the Bennett Institute for Public Policy at the University of Cambridge. And this is the first in a series of vlogs in which I'm going to be talking about well-being, mostly in terms of how you can get more well-being in your life. So I've prepared some slides. Let's get into it. I've just got to share those slides. All right, cool bananas. Slideshow mode. All right, so this is going to be a very long series of vlogs called An Honest Guide to Wellbeing. What's it all about? Well, so I'm an academic. I do interdisciplinary research on wellbeing from a range of perspectives, mostly in public policy, but really from every perspective you can think of. Much of that work doesn't really feel to me like it's that practical for people. I mean, obviously, a lot of the audience is other university staff, also a lot of people who work in government. But ultimately, what got me interested in well-being 15 years ago or something was more like kind of therapy. And indeed, I don't think that a lot of therapy texts are particularly useful to people either, because therapy texts are written for people who are in a really bad way. The point of positive psychology originally as a movement was to try to focus on how to attain super health. So not just the absence of psychopathology like depression and anxiety and this kind of stuff, but actually feeling really, really good about your life and about how things were going. And I've worked quite a lot on how to achieve that, and I'd like to share that with people. Now, one of the benefits of doing this in a vlog or in a popular book is that there are a lot of academic rules. For example, peer review, which is obviously a very good thing, empirical rigor, which is obviously a very good thing, and also disciplinary silos, which is that, philosophers don't really talk to people who are not philosophers, and psychologists don't really talk to people who are not psychologists, and so on. And this is probably a bad thing, that prevent me from writing the way I often want to. So I think I actually much prefer to write in a very kind of direct style, talking to people, and in a manner that's quite loose, and often loose as well in terms of empirics. So there are some things where I think we don't have particularly good evidence yet, but I have hypotheses, and I can present these hypotheses in a I would like to think, a fairly logically compelling way. And I can't do this in my academic work, but I can do it in a pop book where I say, look, this is just kind of my opinion now. And I will try throughout this exercise to show you what is empirically validated versus what is just my opinion. But for the most part, it'll just be presented as my opinion. So the solution for me for all these problems was just to write a popular book. And this vlog is going to be a summary of that popular book recorded as I'm writing it. So I'm currently writing it, and I hope for it to be done by sort of mid-2022. And that'll keep me motivated and make the book more accessible for people who don't like reading. So what's the book about? Well, as I said, it's called An Honest Guide to Wellbeing. Hopefully this will be the cover. I don't want any random crap on the cover, because one thing that really annoys me is that when you go into the self-help section or the, as this seems, personal growth section of a bookstore, there's just heaps of bullshit there, frankly. So, the new trend is just to put fuck in the title of every book. Fuck feelings by the authors of Fuck Love. Everything is fucked by the author of The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. Calm the fuck down. I used to be a miserable fuck. This is bollocks, right? It's just a load of kind of marketing garbage to get people to buy these books. There's not going to be a lot of marketing garbage in this book. It's quite a hard book to read. It's quite a dense book in a lot of ways. I'm going to try to make sure that it's not too academic, but it's also not going to be some poppy thing that you read on the tube and laugh about occasionally, and that never really then has much of an effect on your life. And the key point I want to make from the outset is that well-being is very, very complicated. There are a lot of different things going on that a lot of different perspectives are required to understand. The perspectives from psychology are missing a lot of stuff from philosophy. If we want to talk about public policy, both of those perspectives are missing a lot from economics, and so on. You've got to bring all of that stuff together into a coherent, internally consistent framework that is practical and applicable in a fairly straightforward way, and something that people can understand. That's going to be really difficult. You cannot put it into 150 words with a snazzy title and a bunch of blank pages for people to write in like personal reflections, and everything will be done by the end. one thing that really frustrates me in this space is there's a lot of people who've barely ever thought about well-being. If something happens to them, they go away for a few months and they think about it and they think, oh, that was really successful to me. I've solved happiness. I've solved well-being. I better write a book about it. And then these books are just shallow as shit, all right? So they give you one small aspect of a much bigger problem. Now, there are some really good books in this space. This is a couple of examples. The problem is that all these books, even the ones that are very rich and have a lot of ideas in them, like The Happiness Hypothesis by Jonathan Haidt, these books tend to be still a bit too narrow, right? So no one's putting them all together. And part of the reason for that is that the marketing side of publishing wants these books to have tons of anecdotes and tons of fluffy asides where everything's written in a way like it's a New Yorker article and you just sort of muse on it and it vaguely entertains you. I don't have time for that, right? I've been working on these things for a very long time. I think they're really hard, really complicated. You need to get everything going into one book. And I want it to be kind of accessible, not too many hundreds of pages, but there'll be a few hundred. But in any case, a comprehensive account of well-being, no bullshit. Because it's so comprehensive, I don't have space for things like anecdotes. I mean, sometimes I will try to illustrate things with an example, perhaps even a real life example, but I'm not going to labor these like 9-page anecdotes about Sergey who like fled this country and tried to like forge meaning in his life or something like that, right? There'll be none of this kind of stuff because I got a lot of material that I need to cover and we're going to try to get through all of it. Another thing that's going to be really, I hope, a strength of this book is that it's going to integrate a very wide literature because I'm an unusually interdisciplinary scholar of this topic. So a lot of these books here are written by psychologists and they're very good, but they often represent only a psychological perspective or indeed only a perspective from one particular domain of psychology. So for example, Dan Gilbert's Stumbling on Happiness is a really excellent book and a very good complement to his book, Predictably Irrational. Well, that might be Dan O'Reilly. I might be confusing myself here. But in any case, that book really comes out of the behavioral psychology tradition. And so there's not a lot of content in there, for example, self-determination theory, which I think is a really important theory for understanding well-being. Equally, even books like The Happiness Hypothesis, which it contains quite a lot of philosophical discussion of things like Stoicism and that sort of thing, is just not really comprehensive enough because these people are specialists in a discipline primarily before they are someone who does well-being within that discipline. I am not a disciplinary specialist. My PhD is in economics, but I don't think of myself as an economist. I think of myself as a well-being specialist, and I come at it from a whole lot of different perspectives. So some of the things that we will be seeing in this vlog and in the book is I'm going to be drawing a lot on self-determination theory, also a lot of early psychoanalysis from Jung in particular, a bunch of existential philosophy and Stoicism. So we'll be hearing a lot from de Beauvoir and Nietzsche, but also from Marcus Aurelius. And then I'm also going to be talking heaps and heaps about morality and culture, particularly in the final stages. And I think a really good representative example of that sort of material is Herb Gintis's Individuality and Entanglement, the Moral and Material Bases of Social Life. All right, so what kind of theory of well-being am I going to be talking about? So this is basically it, and I do think of it as a hierarchy. So quite recently, I was thinking of these as just 3 separate dimensions, but I do think they're related to each other. So most of the material that you'll come across in well-being from psychologists in the pop literature, this sort of stuff, is really focused on moods and emotions. It's about how to be happy. And happiness is, in my opinion, mostly about mood and mostly about your emotional state. And it doesn't really engage with these deeper issues. And part of the reason why it doesn't engage with deeper issues is because in many cases, those deeper issues are taken care of. And I want to stress that if you're broadly someone whose life is like fine, you know, you got a career, you got a family that you get along with, you got friends who you get along with, everything's going pretty well. You're just looking for like a bit more of buzz in it, right? You just want to be a little bit more upbeat, a little bit more positive, a little bit more optimistic. Then this mood and emotions literature is absolutely what you're looking for, and you should devour it. And I think one of the best examples is up there in the top right-hand corner, this book by Sonia Lyubomirsky on the how of happiness. And she's got another book more recently, I think, called The Happiness Myths or something like that. Lyubomirsky's work on mood is tremendous, really empirically rigorous as well. And I think you should just read everything that she's written, even the academic literature, if you want. However, there are a lot of people whose moods and emotions have broken down, not because of anything to do with moods and emotions, but because of deeper issues, right? So You can eat a piece of cake and feel good about the cake. However, if you're depressed because, I don't know, say your partner has died, right? Then eating the cake might make you feel better briefly, but you're pretty quickly going to return to those feelings of bereavement. And that's because there's no bringing that person back. And that's a really hard case, bereavement, because as I just said, there's no bringing that person back. But in a lot of cases that cause these kind of prolonged periods of bad mood, there are underlying drivers that you can address. So, for example, self-determination theory emphasizes that we have three basic psychological needs for autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And so, for example, if you live in the Rust Belt of America at the moment, where there's been sustained deindustrialization over 30 years, and so there's very few jobs for people with your skill set, which is mostly sort of menial skills. You previously worked in a car factory or something like that. You might start to feel really incompetent because you don't have the skills you need to thrive. You might have to take a job that really is not a good job, is not a job that you feel gives you dignity, is not a job that you feel allows for any kind of self-expression. Maybe you're an Uber driver, for example. And I'm not down on Uber. I think Uber is actually quite a great thing for the most part, obviously in need of some reforms. The point is more that you're taking a job that's available, not because you want it, but because you have to. And so that's going to make you feel a lack of autonomy. Now, meanwhile, your community is going under. People, all the young people are moving away, all the old people are dying of cancer, and generally the whole place is decaying. And literally, sometimes you'll see that in the urban environment. There will be urban decay and urban blight. And that's going to make you feel a lack of relatedness. You're not going to be connected to that community anymore. So at that point, your basic psychological needs will be shot. Now, probably if your basic psychological needs are not being nourished, then you're going to have really bad moods and really poor emotions. But if someone comes along and said to you, oh, well, you just need to fix your emotions. Here's a bunch of mood management tools. Practice gratitude. Think about the things that you're grateful for, or kind of practice mindfulness, right, so that you can manage this stress. Now that might kind of help as a band-aid, right? It might ameliorate your symptoms to some extent, but you are treating the symptoms there, not the cause. And so a lot of the time we need to treat those causes. Now, in the case of someone in the Rust Belt, it might be really hard. There are overarching macroeconomic and public policy questions there. There's not necessarily a lot of power that that person has, but it might be possible for them to move or reskill or do something along the lines to try to improve their competence. That will in turn give them more autonomy because it will open more jobs for them, will allow them to move into a slightly more thriving area and connect with people in that space and afford to go bowling with their friends and these kind of things, right? Now, I think even basic psychological needs, which is to my mind an extremely sophisticated psychological theory of well-being and of motivation, and plugs into a whole lot of other theories that I'll come to when we get to that stage in the book, assumes a foundation that I think is increasingly not there in a lot of developed countries in particular, which is the cultural foundation for basic psychological needs. So this is quite a complex issue, and I don't want to go into it too much depth here, but let me try something succinct. So the basic psychological need for relatedness is about feeling loved and cared for, about being plugged into a community of like-minded individuals. When we start thinking about like-minded individuals, we assume a bunch of people who share certain values and who practice those values through rituals and symbolic language. The easiest way to think about this kind of stuff is through religions, right? So religions hold certain values and they have a lot of customs and rituals that go along with those values, right? Going to church on Sunday, tithing 10% of your income, participating in church activities, praying before dinner or, multiple times a day. It may be going to a church that is decorated in a particular way and really manifests in a symbolic way a lot of those values. At the moment, we are going through a period of what Viktor Frankl, who was a psychoanalyst in the early 20th century, described as a period of existential vacuum, which is a situation where a lot of the meaning and a lot of this kind of intersubjectively sustained value has disappeared. So there's been an enormous cultural upheaval over the last 100 years or so, particularly since the end of World War II. So we've had birth control come in. That was a kind of major technological driver of it. In America, you've seen a lot of things that earlier happened in Europe with migration from rural into metropolitan areas, women's empowerment in the 50s, a lot of the changes around race relations, massive changes in people's attitude to religion. So atheism has been rising generally, and not just atheism in the aggressive Dawkins form, but also atheism in a kind of more benign, just sort of not religious sort of way. Like people aren't practicing religion. Materialism plugged that vacuum for a long time, but now even materialism seems to be giving way because we're noticing that having a four-wheel drive in a big house doesn't necessarily seem to make you particularly happy. It doesn't give you meaning. It doesn't give you community. It doesn't make you feel like you're a good person, this kind of stuff. And so we're now in this broad period of this vacuum. And so we need to kind of rebuild this bedrock of values, meaning, and culture. And if we don't rebuild that bedrock, then it's very difficult for us to have feelings of relatedness in many cases. As well, it might plug through into feelings of autonomy and competence. So, for example, if I really care about vegetarianism, but there's no one in my immediate vicinity who also cares about vegetarianism, and I can't convince anyone to care about vegetarianism, then I'm going to start to feel really incompetent. And I might also struggle with autonomy because none of the restaurants in the area will have anything vegetarian on the menu, for example. I should say that I am not a vegetarian, but I'm also very opposed to factory farming. All right, so let me just briefly summarize this sheet then. So I don't want to focus just on moods. The first part of the book is very much about mood management because I think this is very important for a lot of people. People have terrible mental hygiene, as we might call it, as in they don't practice mood management techniques or cognitive behavioral therapies in their day-to-day life in a way that's beneficial to them. But I also don't want to oversell mood management as the be-all and end-all of well-being. I think a lot of people who think that all we need is for people to get better at managing their moods take for granted these two deeper layers of basic psychological needs, values, meaning, and culture. I have one friend or one colleague rather who really advocates for mood and emotions a lot and doesn't seem to realize that they themselves have a very strong ethical community around them who espouse their values and promote their values and allow them to participate in a wider group of people who are engaged in meaningful activities, right? But if they didn't have that, then I suspect that they would suddenly think that that's much more important than just the moods and emotions. So the book is going to follow this kind of structure. We're going to start with the moods, then we're going to talk about basic psychological needs and the broader process of how to meet those in a coherent way that's practical. And then at the end, I'm going to be talking about values, meaning, and culture, which I think is an extremely hard topic. I'm going to have a whole separate book on it. Most of this stuff is just going to be about nihilism here. Okay, so that's kind of what I've got here. So the first section of the book is going to be about basic skills. We're going to be looking at things like stoicism, mood management practices, mindfulness, gratitude, self-compassion, etc. And then also the right sort of attitude for well-being. So being fallibilist, which is thinking that you might be wrong and being comfortable with that kind of ambiguity. Understanding that you're prone to cognitive bias and that can play into your well-being in helpful and less helpful ways. The issue of the atonic treadmill, which is something I'm talking about in this session a lot as well. And then I think some are just the kind of absolute prerequisite skills for self-actualization and for the rest of the book. So if you can't metacognate and if you're really not aware of your own thought processes, then you're going to have a very hard time with the more advanced skills that come later in the book. The second half of the book is second third, I should say, is about the architecture of well-being, or that's the kind of the name of it. And that's when we'll start to get into kind of bigger, more complex notions. So the thrust of that section will be on basic psychological needs, extrinsic and intrinsic motivation and goals, and the process of self-actualization more broadly. But I'll also be talking a lot about how well-being fits together in a kind of complex way. I think for most people, the first 2/3 of the book will be completely adequate, and there's absolutely no need for them to go into the third part of the book. And indeed, I would not suggest reading the third part of the book or the third set of vlogs here, unless the themes that I'm about to discuss are things that are already kind of salient for you. Like if things like nihilism, which is the feeling that life is pointless, is a feeling that you already have, then you really need the third part of the book. I think I dare say it's going to be one of the best things written on this topic. But if that means nothing to you and if you have no idea what I just said, then please don't read it, right? Because it's just going to be a train wreck. The problem with nihilism is that it's one of these things that once you're in it, it's very hard to get out. But if you never fall into it, it's not a problem. I think part of the reason why we have not dedicated a lot of research resources to nihilism is that most people who work in research spaces have never been afflicted with it. They've grown up in very wholesome families, very wholesome communities, been socialized into networks of meaning and value, and it's just not really a problem. The people who end up finding nihilism are people that are really depressed in particular, and people that feel disconnected and alienated from their communities. And this is not, I don't think, a particularly widespread phenomenon. A lot of the best work on this was done in the 50s in philosophical books that are extremely dense and not accessible to the general reader. So I try to do a lot of translation of that material. So the third part of the book is really about overcoming despair, which is the sense that life is pointless, the sense that you don't know who you are, and the sense that you're always disconnected from yourself when you make decisions. And that'll make more sense once I get to that point. And then it's also going to be about the notion of metamodernity and the reconstruction of values after postmodernism. So we are living through a very relativistic period at the moment. I don't think relativism is scary. Jordan Peterson has become a very controversial character lately, but I think he's really excellent on a lot of these themes. One thing that I really disagree with Peterson on is that he's very scared of relativism. He thinks relativism is something really dangerous, that nihilism is not something that you should engage with. It's just something that you need to kind of work away from. I have the very opposite view that nihilism, once you're in it, is something you really need to dwell with and spend a lot of time in it. Indeed, you can walk through nihilism and you come out the other end much better. I mean, I think nihilism is actually an incredibly liberating experience. And then you realize that you are now free to create value and to organize with other people who are so liberated to create values on the basis of autonomous value creation, which is very different from what we've had previously, where communities have socialized people from birth into value systems. And it's been very difficult to genuinely say that people are at liberty to construct their value systems. That, of course, is a very difficult task. And I don't particularly envy people that have to do it. But if you are already on the way, which is probably something that has come to you exogenously, then I hope this book will be useful to you. I'll be talking about Nietzsche a lot in the third part of the book. And I think this quote is really kind of reflective of a lot of that material. So people are really scared of nihilism, right? They're always like, oh, fuck, everything's real bad. I'm stuck in relativism. But actually, if you spend some time with it, you'll find that it can be quite helpful. And I think this quote from Nietzsche really speaks to that. I am a forest and night of dark trees, but he who is not afraid of my darkness will find banks full of roses under my cypresses. So I'll leave nihilism for now for a long time. Probably in like 50 blogs time, we'll come back to nihilism. But these kind of themes will be there a lot. Right, let me get to some more kind of light and coherent, solid material. All right, the first thing I want to say is that happiness is not well-being. This is kind of not a linguistic claim. I'm defining terms here. So I think in a lot of work, happiness is used synonymously with well-being. I'm not like that, and it really frustrates me when people do that. So happiness, to my mind, is about mood and emotional state. Well-being is a richer concept. It's what makes life go well for us. Well-being is what's good for you. Now, happiness may be a necessary, indeed, I think it is a necessary condition for well-being, but it's not sufficient, right? You need more than happiness for well-being. Happiness goes beyond your moods, as that pyramid showed earlier. Well-being, I would say, has three components, broadly speaking. You have hedonia, which is how pleasant is your life. And it's very important for life to be pleasant. There's a great quote from Epicurus where he says something like, it's impossible to lead a pleasant life without leading a life that's also like thoughtful and heavy, but equally it's impossible to have a thoughtful and heavy life without having a pleasant life. If you're constantly struggling for food and you're cold and you're exposed to the elements, then you're not going to be able to get a lot of good thinking done. But equally, if you can't get a lot of good thinking done, it's going to be actually very hard for you to live a pleasant life. Epicurus is often presented as this kind of like mindless hedonist who just thinks we should get drunk and have orgies all the time. And I think that's really sad that that's kind of his legacy, because he was a much more sophisticated thinker than that. The second component is eudaimonia. Now, I'm probably guilty of using this word incorrectly here. So the Greeks and a lot of people that use this word have quite a particular meaning for it. The way I use it is very reminiscent of that, closely tied to it, but maybe a bit different. So I'm really kind of contrasting it with hedonia here. and eudaimonia is about how fulfilling your life is. And it's really going to be about those three basic psychological needs for autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So this picture here is of a bunch of Indian physicists and engineers and others who were involved in launching a space mission to Mars, a rocket. And you can see how stoked they are that was successful and that the satellite's on its way. And this is really a team effort. All these people care about the same values, and together as a group, they have achieved the goals that they had set themselves individually and as a group. And so they're going to have good autonomy, good competence, good relatedness. And then the final component is conscience, or I'm calling it conscience, which is how valuable is your life. And the picture that I've associated with this here is Martin Luther, who famously founded Lutheranism, a branch of the Christian faith, by hammering a kind of bunch of thoughts onto the wall of the local Catholic church. And a very famous quote from Luther is that, he says, "Here I stand, I can do no other." And I mean, there's a lot in that quote to talk about, but the essence of it is this notion of individual conscience, that you must feel like you do what you think is right, and that other people, it matters to you that you obey yourself, that you have integrity, that you are a good person, and that other people think you're a good person. And I think this is an area that psychology at present tiptoes around. It's doing a lot of really good work in moral psychology, but has yet to kind of really link moral psychology with well-being. And Jonathan Haidt's work is a little bit of an exception to this, but even he, I don't think, has really kind of gone full ball on it. Whereas I will try to in this text. All right. Now we start to get into the first kind of basic skill and one of the main lessons that I want to have, and that will be the end of this intro video. So you often hear this phrase, "I just want to be happy." And I read this in literature sometimes, like books that are trying to be really sophisticated. And I just think this phrase, "I just want to be happy," is such a like basic bitch thing to say. But it's really, really omnipresent. It's written into Anglophone culture at an institutional level. So the US Constitution gives everyone a right to pursue happiness. The problem with "I just want to be happy," to my mind, is that it's a desire for tranquility. Everything's just so complicated. I just want to be happy. Like, I just want to be chill, And I think this is a real massive waste of your life. Your life is much grander than this. So let's just hear a couple of choice quotes from literature, which is something that I can do in this context that I can't do academically. So I'm looking forward to it. So Aldous Huxley wrote an amazing dystopic book called Brave New World, arguably not dystopic. That's one of its geniuses, about a future where, every time someone feels a bit sad, they can just pop some methamphetamine, or, it's a drug called Soma. It's not clear what chemical it actually contains, but anyway, it makes you feel better. It's kind of like antidepressant. And in this future, some people who are a bit dissatisfied with this status quo go to what's called the savage reservation, where just kind of regular present day humans live, and they find a savage there, and they bring this savage back to headquarters, where he meets Mustafa Mond, who's the kind of enlightened technocratic ruler of this happy future society, and they start to have a conversation about well-being. And the savage says to Mustafa Mond, "But I don't want comfort. I want God. I want poetry. I want real danger. I want goodness, and I want sin." "In fact," said Mustafa Mond, "you're claiming the right to be unhappy." "It's all right then," said the savage defiantly. "I'm claiming the right to be unhappy." And I don't think Mustafa Mond's right. I think actually these things are intimately tied to your happiness. But there is a sense in which happiness goes beyond well-being. That's what I mostly want to emphasize here. On something more towards tranquility, there's this absolutely wonderful, one of my all-time favorite books by Tom Robbins called Jitterbug Perfume. And in that, the main character is, if I remember correctly, talking to one of Pan's nymphs when he says this. He says, "Salvation is for the feeble." That's what I think. I don't want salvation. I want life, all of life, the miserable as well as the superb. And this is an attitude that really, I think, stands in opposition to tranquility, that a lot of what makes life awesome, and I think that's the word that I would use, that makes it really grand and fabulous and wonderful, is only possible because there is a lot in life that is also really shit. Now, I'm not saying that we should embrace smallpox or cholera or something horrible like that. There are a lot of just terrible things that exist in life, and we should work really hard to eradicate them so they never come back. And as far as tranquility is associated with that, I'm all for it. But at the same time, you think of something simple like when you're running a marathon, you don't necessarily feel great during the marathon. You feel great afterwards. And there's a lot in life that's similar. Part of the reason why memories are so beautiful and nostalgic is because they're past and you can't go back to them. And that's at once a really sad and almost brutal feeling, that melancholy. But at the same time, it gives you this really nice, pleasant glow. And you know that you had that thing, right? And I could go on and on and on with a lot of examples of things where life is only awesome because it has this kind of bitterness to it. So you have to take all of it together. And in the third part of the book, particularly when we're looking at Nietzsche's work, that was a really fundamental part of his thinking. All right, one last kind of point on this. So there's a scene in Wall Street 2, Money Never Sleeps, where Charlie Sheen, or rather Michael Douglas's character, who's recently got out of prison for insider trading, meets his old protege, Charlie Sheen, who kind of gave up the life of insider trading, threw Michael Douglas under a bus, and thereby got out of prison himself. And Michael Douglas says to him, "Well, how are you going? What are you doing?" And Charlie Sheen says, "Well, I mean, he's there with his two supermodel girls who have, pearls the size of my thumb." And he says, well, life, you're looking at it. Golf, philanthropy. And it's kind of implied that Charlie Sheen's having a great time. But I was like, oh my God, this is so boring. This is what a lot of FIRE people want: financial independence, retire early. But inevitably, the problem with FIRE logic is that the people who subscribe to it never think what they're going to do when they're independent and retired. So what they don't understand, or what a lot of people don't understand, is they just go for the money. And then they think, oh, I have enough money. What's the goal of that money? The goal is to retire early and be financially independent. And then what are you going to do? And I don't think anyone really thinks about that. They think, oh, I'm going to play golf. Yeah, cool, golf. Golf for 12 hours a day. That's fun. You can play golf now instead of working 12 hours a day. You could just work for 6 hours a day and play golf for 6. You could do that right now. You don't have to work your butt off and be financially independent and retire early. And I think generally there's this problem where people think about getting money and then they'll deal with the rest later. And the problem with that is you never know how much money you're going to need. There's a great scene in Wall Street 2 where they ask the villain, how much money before you retire? And he says more. Yeah, and he means that really authentically. That's why he's such a good character, right? Because he's quite genuine. But for most people, I think the answer is more, but they haven't even thought that through. He has thought it through. And so I don't get the sense that Charlie Sheen engages in his philanthropy from a particularly authentic point here in this movie, right? He's probably like, oh yeah, I'll write a check for that. But he's not really invested in, I don't know, building wells in Africa or something, right? And with the golf too, I mean, that's not a life. So what you really should think about, and I'll cover this more later in the book, is what do you want money for? What do you want anything for? What do you want resources for? What do you want to do with your life? What are the values that animate you? What are the behaviors that you enjoy doing? Who are the people that you enjoy hanging out with? And what resources do you need to facilitate that? Now, if you don't need a lot of money because ultimately what you like doing is surfing or something, then you can easily just get a job as a barista and go surfing. It's not a big deal. Think about what you need to do. Now, if you're someone who really likes driving Ferraris, then you're probably going to need a lot of money. So maybe you need to think about banking. But you shouldn't just go do banking because you make a lot of money, because banking might be a job that you hate, right? So we're going to have to think about that. All right. The other reason why I just want to be happy is a lame thing to say and a silly kind of ambition, is because as it turns out, happiness is your natural state. So we are neurochemically wired to be pretty positive. Not super happy, not like, hey, and do you really want to be like that anyway? But just generally positive, upbeat, optimistic. Mood is what's called homeostatically protected. Now, the empirical literature on this is not that compelling, but I think it's fairly compelling. The basic idea is that your neurochemistry maintains your mood at a fairly high baseline. Think of it from an evolutionary point of view. So depression is bad for your survival because you lack energy and you lack motivation. Mania is equally bad for your survival because if life's really good, you're like the squirrel who doesn't plan for the winter. You become lazy, you become indolent, you just want to indulge in this lovely life. And then all of a sudden life catches up to you and you're not prepared and you get smashed. And that's true in evolutionary circumstances in particular. So you don't plan for the winter, for example. Mania can also make you just burn out too quickly. So if you're, and this is something that, a lot of young people experience when they get really hooked on party culture, is that that's really fun for a while, but then ultimately you find that you've just got nothing left in the tank. And you also have not built any kind of principle, any chunk of resources that you can now draw down over a long life in order to sustain that high positive state for a long time rather than just for the weekend, right? And you've got a hangover, which is always bad. So one way to think about this as well is like, have you ever come across an unhappy baby or even unhappy children? And indeed, if you go to places where people are in quite dire poverty, often they can see ways that their life could be much, much better, but their mood is not generally terrible, right? So you do, obviously, in places of dire poverty, most people are very depressed. But even in places of very, very modest wealth, like rural Indonesia, people can often be quite happy. Their moods are quite positive. They have generally good emotional states, right? So your natural state is to be happy. Depression and these states where people have really bad moods that are durably bad, they don't snap back to a kind of 7 out of 10 level. This is what we call homeostatic defeat. So something has gone really wrong, and that chemical system can't bring you back into baseline. And this is the origin of the depression is just a chemical imbalance way of thinking about depression, which has, as I just described, some merit, but is ultimately not a very sophisticated way of thinking about depression, because something happened to create that homeostatic defeat. And if we address that, then we will get rid of the depression. If we address the chemicals without getting rid of that thing in the background, it's quite possible that we won't get rid of the depression, because as soon as we remove, say, the antidepressants, that depression will become roaring back. All right. So if I've just said that your natural state is to be happy, well, then you might be kind of like, well, no, that's bullshit. Like, I'm not happy. I feel quite bad a lot of the time. I'm not maybe not depressed, but sort of like just a bit off, like something is missing from my life. And that's true. And that feeling is what most of this book's going to be about. It's not really about the moods. It's about that feeling where you're like, something's a bit off, something's missing. I want more. Like, what's going on? So the key here is that while your mood is homeostatically protected, your satisfaction with life overall, what we might call your evaluative well-being, is actually wired for restlessness. So we're generally upbeat, but restless. And the idea here is that that system, that chemical system, that neurological system keeps you active. That's the key thing, right? Shortly after you get something, you've achieved a goal, right? You had breakfast. Now you're going to go off and do an adventure. But also, like, you got promoted at work. Now you want the next promotion at work. This is called the hedonic treadmill. As soon as you get something, you're happy briefly, but then you want something more, right? And not having it makes you a little bit miserable, a little bit restless, and you want to go for it. Now, this is again an evolutionary thing. It's called the Red Queen's race. So the Red Queen is a character in Alice in Wonderland, and she always says that you've got to run really fast to stay in the same place. And that's the way that evolution works. If you stop evolving, if you stop working hard, if you stop trying to get ahead, then the environment will overtake you, right? Predators will get more sophisticated at killing you. And because you're not getting more sophisticated at defending yourself from those predators, they will kill you and you'll disappear. So you always have to be getting better at what it is that you do. This is the Red Queen's race. And this neurocircuitry that encourages us to be a bit restless and always going for a new thing and a new thing helps us stay ahead of that Red Queen's race. Now, some people just want to get off the hedonic treadmill. And I don't blame you for that. The hedonic treadmill can be kind of annoying. If you think that way, then my suggestion is that you try Buddhism. Buddhism has a lot going for it. And Buddhism really kind of begins from this idea. It begins from the idea that desire just brings suffering. And one of the main things that we need to do is try to kind of eliminate desire. And then you won't have this hedonic treadmill problem anymore. What I do in this book is really kind of the opposite in a way. I suggest that you learn to enjoy running on the hedonic treadmill. I think the hedonic treadmill is great fun. It makes life really awesome, but you've got to get some wisdom around it. You've got to know how to run in a way that is enjoyable, in a way that helps you flourish. The key to enjoying running is to know where you're going, to value that place that you're going. If you don't value it, then start running towards something different, and feel that you're getting closer to that thing, right? What's kind of depressing about the treadmill is the notion that you're in the same place, but we can keep running while we're still kind of making progress towards something, right? And that something has to be something that we value, that we think is meaningful, that we think is worth pursuing, worth running towards. Now, I want to stress that this is not some kind of business self-help book. I'm not here about success. It's not like be the best you or some shit. For a lot of people, that goal that you want to run towards might be very mundane. You know, you might just want like, you know, a room of one's own, or, you know, a place to raise your kids, or you might want a vegetable patch in a country town that's kind of pleasant with some nice neighbors, and you just potter about there and have a nice time. I've got absolutely no dramas with that. If that is what really is your kind of best realized self and a goal in a life that you really want to live, and as you live it, you find that it really is quite super enjoyable, like I've got no problems with that, then great. I'm all for that. All right. I'm not going to be suggesting in this book that you have some super ambitious lifestyle. This architecture that I'm going to propose is both good for people who are super ambitious, like myself, or people who have much more mundane dreams. The ideas should map onto every different thing that you can imagine. All right, a quick digression on this stuff, a kind of academic digression. So many well-being scholars will argue that life satisfaction, this evaluative well-being, is you're not restless, or like that's kind of the wrong way of thinking about it. It's characterized by what's called adaptation to set points. So the way I described homeostatically protected mood is how they think life satisfaction works. So we tend to feel 7 out of 10 or 8 out of 10. And after a shock, like getting promoted at work or getting fired, we go down or up, but then pretty quickly we converge back to that baseline at 7 or 8 out of 10. And this is your set point. And there's some empirical evidence to suggest that this is genetically determined, or substantially genetically determined. I think there's a lot correct about this way of thinking. So of course, I think homeostatically protected mood is right, and that's kind of evidenced in this way. But as I said, I don't think that evidence is that compelling. But broadly, I think this set point theory idea is fundamentally wrong. And the main thing that it misses is that you are maybe restless. You get something, then you want something more, but you're still more satisfied than you were before. So the 7 out of 10 that you say you are now is a higher level of satisfaction than the 7 out of 10 you said before, right? And the reason why we don't observe this is because the instrument that we use to measure people's satisfaction, these scales, how satisfied are you with your life on a scale from 0 to 10, are bad instruments. So think about a simple athletic goal. Like, I want to get better at doing push-ups. So you want to do 20 push-ups. Right now, you can only do 10 push-ups. So you train really hard and pretty quickly you can do 20 push-ups. Then you think maybe, now I want to do one arm push-ups, right? So an even higher goal. And now you're restless again because you're like, oh, I can't do a one arm push-up. Damn it, I've got to go and practice hard and do my push-ups, right? And so it might seem like you got a little bit happier because you could do 20 push-ups and now you're back down at that baseline. But that's not quite true, because you are more satisfied with your life now than when you could only do 10 push-ups. You've achieved something. You've improved yourself. You know yourself better. You've self-actualized, right? You are the kind of person that you wanted to be. These are the mechanisms by which we get sustained growth in our well-being. Set point theory misses this because of the scale use. The problem is that the qualitative meaning of the scale changes over time. So I'm just going to give you a quick graphical explanation of this. If you want any more information, I'll put links into both an academic paper that I have on this and a webinar where I explain that paper. So think about this situation here. On the y-axis, you've got life satisfaction. On the x-axis, you've got waves of an annual survey where one of these scale questions is asked. So in the first wave, the person says that they're 7 out of 10. You can see that on the red bar. The red bar is the scale that they're using that year. So this person says that they're 7 out of 10, and that is in fact what their latent life satisfaction is as well. The next year, their life gets a bit better, so they say they're 8 out of 10. At this point, their life satisfaction report is still commensurate with their real life satisfaction. But by the third wave, they're now 10 out of 10 on their latent life satisfaction. But they don't want to say that this is the best life they possibly have, because they can still see it being even better. You know, maybe they've gone from doing regular push-ups to doing diamond push-ups to doing one-arm push-ups, and now they want to do planches or something, right? Or they want to go up and do some gymnastics. So they think, well, it could be better, but I'm also better than last year. So they don't want to say 10 out of 10. So what they do instead is they change the scale that they're using. So you can see that the scale shifts up. So this person says 8 out of 10 again, but this 8 out of 10 corresponds to a higher level of satisfaction than the previous 8 out of 10. All right. Anyway, what's my takeaway message? My takeaway message is that you're wired to be in a decent mood, but restless with your life. So we want to develop a practice, a theory of well-being, a way of living that increases the frequency and duration of our good moods. Why not? Good to be in a good mood. Decreases the frequency and duration of our bad moods. Now, you want to get the signaling effect of a bad mood, but you don't want to just dwell in it. That's not helpful. And then most importantly, we want a way of living that puts us in a virtuous cycle, so a self-reinforcing cycle, upward spiral, of pursuing and achieving goals that are meaningful, such that we feel like we're progressing towards something valuable. And that's going to ameliorate that feeling of restlessness. Now, it'll come back, but then immediately we'll be back in that virtuous cycle. So we'll just keep ameliorating it. And every time we do, we feel good for a while, and then we'll do it again real quick. And we'll always be progressing towards something, right? So we always feel like we're getting better. And in my experience, this feeling of congealing into something really valuable sustains your well-being in the long term and grows your feeling of well-being. Right? Now, note that there's no tranquility here. Quite the opposite. There's kind of endless busyness, right? That's the essence of it. You're always working towards something, but it's cool. It's great. You feel like you're building something excellent. And it'll never be finished, but as you build it, it just gets better and better. Now, this theory, I'm going to sketch it over many, many vlogs. But I'll give you a one-slide summary here. So I call it the Coalescence of Being. I've got academic papers on it that you can read if you want from my personal website. The basic idea is that your affective systems, this is your moods, emotions, your feelings, it's a means to an end, right? So sometimes people think of it as the end itself. If you're in a good mood, everything's great. But we know that's not true, right? You could be in a good mood because you're watching a funny film, but in the back of your mind, you're really stressed about work, for example, and then you're not well, right? You've got to figure out what's going on at work in order to be sustained in your well-being. Rather, it's a means, right? And how is it a means? It's a means because your affective system guides the process of self-actualization. Self-actualization is this longer-term process that puts us in this virtuous cycle. It guides that self-actualization. So what we do is we go out into the world and we interact with it. We think, okay, I want to be good at gymnastics. So we try doing some gymnastics and we find, actually, I'm not really enjoying gymnastics. And now we got to introspect on that, right? We get that affective feedback, that lack of enjoyment. Maybe it's hard to motivate yourself. Maybe you get frustrated with gymnastics. Maybe it's boring, right? These are all kind of affective information. And you introspect on that information. You think about it. What is this telling me? And then you make adjustments. So we think, well, I don't think it's telling me that I don't like exercise. I think what it's telling me is that gymnastics is a bad form of exercise. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to go and join a triathlon club. And then you go over to the triathlon club and you're like, oh, this is like kind of much better. Like I'm sort of enjoying this. Like I like tinkering with my bike. I like the feeling of smashing out Ks. Really importantly, I like the people that are in the triathlon club and I enjoy spending time with them. And this is, again, affective feedback, right? And that affective feedback is telling you that these values and behaviors that you're engaged in are suitable for you. They are what we call self-congruent. And as you pursue and achieve self-congruent values, goals, etc., over many different dimensions of your life, so not just in your hobbies, but in your work, in your family life, in your relationships, in all the rest of it, in your holiday destinations, whatever, it's going to give rise to a preponderance of positive over negative affect because you detach from things that give you bad signals and you comport towards things that give you good signals. But the key thing is that you're not, the end goal is not the signals. The end goal is to be living a life that suits you, that is not just something that brings you a lot of joy, but is something in which you manifest values that are meaningful to you, because that, again, is going to put you into this virtuous cycle of pursuing goals that are meaningful and feel like you're making progress towards something valuable, right? That's what gives you sustained motivation. All right. Now, going deeper, self-actualization in this way brings about a self-congruent identity, and that's going to nourish your basic psychological needs. You're going to feel autonomous because you lead the kind of life you want. You detach from things that aren't good for you. You go towards things that are good for you. You make that choice. You are in control. You're going to feel competent because gradually you will detach from things that you're not good at, right? You'll be like, well, this isn't for me. I suck at it. I'm going to do something else. And you're going to go to those things that you are good at, and you're going to get positive feedback because you're going to enjoy doing them, and you're going to feel proud that you do them well, and you're going to do them more. And because you're doing them more, you're going to get better at them, and that's going to make you feel competent. Then you're also going to get the relatedness because you're going to hang around with people who share your values and who boost it all the time. And if you've ever want to see this in action, go and have a look at the big video game conferences. Like, these are people who have a lot of difficulty finding camaraderie. And all of a sudden, you've got people like dancing Gangnam Style and playing video games from the 90s with each other and having an awesome time. And it's being part of that group of people that share your values, affirm your values, represent them through ritual and symbolic language and shared customs. Being part of groups like that is really important for your well-being. That's your relatedness. But you find that through self-actualization, through pursuing these self-congruent goals. Self-actualization brings meaning to your life because you affirm values that are compelling to you. You know, if you're a vegetarian, you're like, oh, I just think it's like really gross to eat factory farmed meat. And so you then stop eating meat and you go hang out with people who stop eating meat. And together you might organize a political campaign to get other people to stop eating meat. And you start to make the world have less factory farming and more vegetarianism. And so you've not only improved yourself, made yourself more in line with your values, but also made the world more in line with your values. And that's a very meaningful activity that brings you a lot of purpose in your life. Self-actualization obviously brings you a lot of identity. You know who you are, right? You reflect on all this information that you get from the world and you think it through and you think, oh, well, gymnastics is not good for me because I find it boring and I don't really care about being stronger. But triathlon's really good for me because I do care about my aerobic fitness and my ability to like run down a gazelle or something on the savannah. Or, you know, you might be joining the vegetarian movement and then you think, well, this is right for me because I just really like these people. I think they're very generous. I think they take ethical matters seriously. And that's the kind of people I want to hang out with, for example. So anyway, you know who you are and you feel like you're progressing dynamically towards that identity. You're growing as a person, deepening as a person, and becoming more sophisticated, right? And so you know who you are, and who you are is also expanding. We have personal growth here. Finally, the integrity that's required for self-actualization. You have to try to affirm the same identity consistently over time. That requires integrity. Integrity solves a lot of the nihilistic, relativistic problems with ethics. This is a super complicated topic, so I'm not going to get into it until we come to nihilism in the vlogs. But I think it's extremely important and has a lot to say for metaethics as well. All right, so that's the end for this first introductory talk, which ended up being much longer than I thought it would be. But whatever, I think I tend to be verbose. So what's next? So this was a very broad overview of some of the ideas in the book and the structure of it. The next few vlogs are going to cover what's called basic skills. So these are prerequisites for effective self-actualization. We're going to look particularly at a bunch of really just general important skills like self-awareness, metacognition, and the right attitude, which includes things like fallibilism. So being comfortable with ambiguity, being open to the idea that your views are wrong, and constantly exposing yourself to kind of new information. And then we're going to move on to techniques of mood management. And this will allow you to really harness your affective system so that it gives you those clear signals and so that you can act on those signals without being really debilitated by the negative ones. And only then do we move on to basic psychological needs. So thanks for listening. And until next time, I'm Mark Fabian, and thanks. Goodbye.